All right. It's great to be back for another episode of Conversations with Friends about Church History. And I'm talking to my friend Ian Clary. Ian is a professor of historical theology at Colorado Christian University in Denver, Colorado. And where are you from originally, Ian?
Well, as your listeners will probably detect after a few minutes of me speaking, you'll hear a Canadian accent. I hope I'm not developing that American accent just yet. So I was born and raised in Windsor, Ontario, which is the border town with Detroit, Michigan. But before moving out here to Colorado, I lived for about 15 years in Toronto. So that's in a sense a kind of home, what I think of when I think of home.
So you have a Southern accent also, just Southern Canada,
Yeah.
Southern
Ontario.
Yeah, there you go. Okay. Well, we have that in common then, our Southern accents.
I guess so. Yours seems somehow more authentic.
That must be why we get along so well.
I suppose.
Yes. Well, we met through Dr. Michael Haykin. You had done the work that I ended up doing after Dr. Haykin came to Southern, working with him at the Andrew Fuller Center for Baptist Studies that had previously been under the auspices, as Dr. Haykin likes to say, of Toronto Baptist Seminary,
Yep.
Where he'd served as principal. And you were his assistant there, having been a student. And then when he came full-time to Southern, I ended up coming into that position here on this side of the States, or this side of the border in
Yep.
the States. So we had that connection. I thought about retitling this podcast instead of Conversations with Friends about Church History, like 2 Degrees of Haykin or something like that.
Or brothers. I mean, he's like a spiritual father to us. So I guess that sort of makes us kind of more spiritual brothers in a way, you know?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
And we've both been impacted tremendously by his work and mentorship and friendship.
Absolutely.
Continues to this day. I've emailed with him today. I'm sure you've been in contact with him recently. And
yeah, this week.
yeah, so just a tremendous spiritual mentor and historical model for us. And he was involved in your work on your dissertation, wasn't he?
He was, yeah. So I had the University of the Free State, where I did my PhD, they call them promoters, so co-promoters. So yeah, Dr. Haykin was sort of the principal one. When I was in Toronto, you know, he lives about 45 minutes away from Toronto. So I did all my face-to-face work with him. And my other supervisor or promoter was Adrian Neely, who at the time split, his year 6 months at the University of the Free State there in Bloemfontein, South Africa, and the other half at Yale's Edwards Center. So I studied at the Edwards Center in Bloemfontein. And now Dr. Neely is at Puritan Reformed Theological Seminary.
So you were there in Canada doing a PhD from a university in South Africa.
That's it.
And working with Dr. Haykin, also in Canada, and Adrian Neely, who was part-time in the United States. So real international flavor.
And Professor Neely is as Dutch as they come. So.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
So and you had you studied under Dr. I know you had, but tell us about, you studied under Dr. Haykin at the Toronto Baptist Seminary before that. Is that where you did your master's?
Yeah, so I first met him. I had started taking courses at the Extension Center for Heritage College and Seminary, where he used to teach. That met in my hometown of Windsor, and so he came and did like a week-long intensive on, it was Church History 2. That was where I first heard of the Puritans. I was like, oh my goodness, these people are amazing. And that was what gave me my love for church history. And then, when he was leaving Heritage to go to TBS, he had started a thing called the Jonathan Edwards Center for Reformed Spirituality. And he asked me to come and help him with that and then be his research assistant. And so I moved to Toronto and did my Master of Divinity and Master of Theology there under him. So yeah, it's kind of bad, kind of good. I think it's great, but some people don't like it when you study under the same guy for all your degrees. But when you're studying with somebody like Dr. Haykin, you know, it's like studying with Einstein. You know?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So
same mustache and everything.
So, and you're working on getting there also. So,
I'm trying. It's a bit feeble of an attempt, but
so, so we got connected through our relationships separately to Dr. Haykin, and eventually we met in person. And you had the idea of a work to honor his work as a church historian and in biblical spirituality. And you came to me about that particular work project you want to do. It ended up being a book that we co-edited, The Pure Flame of Devotion and Essays in Christian Spirituality and the History of Christian Spirituality.
yeah.
And so what gave you that idea? Why did you want to do that? And why did you get me to help you?
Well, I got you to help because you're such a good guy, man. The idea, I mean, it was his 60th birthday in 2013. And I think, so we started working on it, back in 2012. And so then the idea would be to, in academia, scholars will come together to honor a specific occasion in a scholar's life with a book called a Festschrift. And I thought, okay, 60, this is a milestone birthday, let's do something like this. And so you were the obvious guy to want to do that with, just because of the nature of your close friendship with him and your own scholarly work. I mean, by then I think you'd already put out your dissertation and all that kind of stuff. You just seemed like the obvious one to do that with. And, we're friends, so I just knew it would be an enjoyable experience. And it was. Do you remember when we met in, was it Alistair Begg's church?
Yeah, that's
and
right.
I did the work there, and we were staying in some hotel out near there, and you forced me to watch that cowboy TV show. Oh, that's some modern cowboy thing. What was that called again?
Let's not get into that. I'm not allowed to talk about that. But I'd forgotten we watched that. But we did have a good couple of days of working together, just comparing notes and making sure we were on the same page and how we were editing the work, how we were putting notes, and it went a lot smoother than I thought it would in just 2 days to be able to pump out a lot of that work. It really let us then know we were on the same page as we went our ways to finish it up. That was a big job, and you carried a large load of that. Disproportionate load, I'm sure.
I don't remember. Well, what I do remember is, if you recall, Janice Van Eck, who worked with Joshua Press, which is now H&E Publishing in Canada there. She also did a really phenomenal job in terms of the layout and the design and that kind of stuff too.
Yeah.
So, it was overall a really great experience. I just wish I could have been there to have given the book to him. Do you remember that?
Yeah. What happened where you weren't able to?
So remember the plan was, it was Baltimore's, the meeting of the Evangelical Theological Society in Baltimore that year.
Right.
And right near his birthday in November. And so we were going to give it to him as a dinner before ETS started.
Right.
Dr. Moeller spoke. And the people I was driving from Canada with were on the highway.
Oh, yes.
The car died. And so I missed the dinner.
Yeah, that was really sad. I'd forgotten the circumstances that led to that. But that was a very sad occasion. I know for you, it was for me. So, and I was scrambling then. We had Lig and Duncan and Al Moeller and who else was there?
I think Dr. Nettles spoke, didn't he?
Dr. Nettles was there. Fred Zaspel, Steve,
Fred.
Maybe Steve Nichols, Steve Lawson. I don't know. I mean, it's just
all the heavy hitters were there.
Who's who, and I was nervous and sweating trying to make those presentations, but
I was nervous on that side of the highway, hoping, man, I hope we don't get hit.
It was, but we were able to surprise him, and that was tremendous. Of course, you got to be there the next day, I think, and
I showed up later that night and got to hang out with you guys for a little bit afterwards.
We were able to give out the copies of the book. Hines had brought those down, and
Hines,
he brought pieces of those down. So that was a fun time, and really we had what was really great about that is we had everyone we asked, the scholars that we asked, were eager to jump on board.
Absolutely.
So we were able to have a tremendous, we had the scholars on the topics, the preeminent scholars on their topics write about the topics and kind of cover the scope of church history and looking at themes of biblical spirituality and church history. I'm happy with how that turned out, and glad you had that idea.
Yeah.
And glad we got to work together on it, and glad we got to honor Dr. Haykin. So
absolutely,
win.
Totally.
Yeah. So since then, you've done your PhD. You did your dissertation, as we've already talked about. You ended up coming to the States in Colorado, where you're serving at Colorado Christian University. Again, we spoke about that already. Any other things you're involved there? I mentioned you're professor of historical theology. Any other hats? I know at university, a lot of times you get a lot of other jobs put on you. So how's that going?
Yeah, no, it's great down here. I just finished my third year teaching here full time, which is just a great blessing. I mean, as you know, the academic world is really hard to get into, and I walk across the CCU campus, and I pinch myself thinking, how the heck did I get here? So it's a great, it's great. You were there. When was it? You were there in 2018, I think. You came in. You were on campus.
Yeah, I can't remember when I came by we had lunch maybe or something.
Yeah, and it's just God's providence to get in a place like CCU. It really is just going gangbusters. I mean, even in light of the COVID stuff right now, we've just posted another record enrollment for the coming year. I mean, it's just crazy, and everybody's happy. We're hiring. It's just a good place to be. It's a very positive environment, and in terms of the hats that I wear, I mean, I'm responsible for teaching historical theology too. So my colleague Megan DeVore, she's a patristics expert, so she'll do history of Christianity and then historical 1, and then I pick up I started with Bernard and I get down to I think I hit Machen or Lewis, and we just read texts, key texts, kind of work through the classics like Aquinas and Calvin and Edwards and that sort of thing. And but I also teach like intro to theology and philosophy and world religions and New Testament and all this kind of stuff. So they get you doing a lot, but it's an awesome experience. But you and I serve together with the Andrew Fuller Center, with Dr. Haykin, and getting those works of Andrew Fuller published with De Gruyter, which is going to be awesome when that set's done. And then I've just rolled off my term finished with the board for the Davenant Institute. So I had a 3-year term with them. I love the work that Davenant does in terms of like retrieving Protestant wisdom for the church today. They're the kind of like one of the big kind of think tank groups, educational groups, whatever you want to call it, that I'm really excited about. And then I'm happy. I work with a little bit with the Center for Baptist Renewal with Matt Emerson, Luke Stamps, and Center for Ancient Christian Studies with Sean Wilhite and Coleman Ford. And so those are just great people to be even loosely associated with. And then the other thing I do is I teach at Munster Bible College in Cork City in the Republic of Ireland, which is it's like a second home to me. I absolutely love it out there. So, yeah,
it sounds like you're staying busy, and I like that university setting can be challenging with teaching all those different types of courses out of your specialty, but it also keeps you well-rounded and thinking about some issues that I think are probably helpful as you focus on your core discipline to be informed and let each of those subjects inform the others. So that's a blessing, even in that little bit of a struggle that can be.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate your work. I appreciate what you're doing there. And I knew I've been a big fan and advocate of yours early on, and I knew it was a matter of time before you got somewhere, and you were going to be a blessing wherever you ended up. Because,
no, it's kind of it's true. You have. I know you've bugged people about you got to check out this guy, Clary. It's always been so kind of you that you've been that way. You've been a good friend.
Yeah, I saw one of my Facebook memories popped up from several years ago the other day, and it was something puffing you saying, school that gets this guy is going to be blessed or something like that. And I wasn't just saying that. I really believed it and still believe it. Well, I've read your dissertation has been published or is being published.
It's going to be published
later this summer.
Hopefully in the next month. Yeah, it should be by the end of summer. It should be out. It's up on Amazon and all the other places. It's actually just me. I have a couple of last little second edits on the index I need to get in, and then it's done. So
there's the cover. If you're watching, pull the cover up on the YouTube video here. Ian Hugh Clary, Reformed Evangelicalism and the Search for a Usable Past, the Historiography of Arnold Dallimore, Pastor Historian. And I just read through it the last week or so, read through the dissertation or this version of it.
Yeah.
One of the drafts that you were kind enough to share with me. And like you said, it is up on Amazon. Some of you may want to rush over to Amazon, and then you can purchase this. Let's see. I think I've got the screenshot of the Amazon that you can see how affordable this is.
Oh, it's not affordable. That's because your dissertation's published in the same series, and it's expensive.
Yeah, that's right. I forgot to mention that we're in the same series of Reformed historical theology, and can't remember what number my volume is. Do you know what number yours is?
I think I'm 61, volume 61. I think.
I can't remember what volume mine is, but yeah, that's another connection. We were talking before we started the broadcast of we've done a number of things together. We both contributed to the Edwards Encyclopedia that came out recently, both published essays in a Noble Company series, Particular Baptist Press has done, and so and we're in this series together.
Yeah,
and this is this was a real treat. I was telling you earlier, but I'll say it again. It was a real treat to read because you're able to go through this pastor historian, this person that you respected. And you were able to share his story, but also the work he did. He did a monumental landmark study of George Whitefield, a 2-volume study. And you want to say something about how that work has been received and how important that has been really to the rise of a lot of Reformed thought in evangelicalism today. And say something about that before we talk about how you analyzed his work.
Sure. I mean, what I find remarkable about Arnold Dallimore is the fact that he was a man who was trained as a pastor. In fact, he actually went to the seminary I went to, Toronto Baptist Seminary. He of course went in 1935, a lot earlier than I did. And so for somebody who didn't really have formal academic training to be able to put out a thick 2-volume work on a really significant figure who at the time was kind of in the shadows. People weren't really as familiar with Whitefield in the mid to late 20th century, and the fact that he could do that kind of work is really astounding. And that was what kind of like drew me to him, amongst other things. He published it with the great Banner of Truth publishing house out of the UK, out of Scotland. And they have been so instrumental in what we would call today the Reformed renewal, the Reformed resurgence, the young restless Reform movement, however you want to do that. They really function as a kind of like immediate precursor to that whole thing. And Dallimore's book, 2-volume book, is arguably one of the most important works that the Banner's ever published. And so you can just see from that wow, that means that he himself, here's this pastor from a small Canadian hamlet, southwestern Ontario, has had an impact on a movement that Time magazine said, a number of years ago, is one of the top 10 most important movements. That is this kind of young Calvinism. I think probably in my mind, the greatest sort of like example of the importance of Dallimore is illustrated in a talk that D.A. Carson gave with John Piper that got published as The Scholar's Pastor, The Pastor's Scholar. I think co-edited by Owen Strand.
Mm-hmm.
And in the video of it, if you can get that on YouTube, D.A. Carson, who's himself Canadian, his own dad, Tom Carson, was close friends with Arnold Dallimore.
Yeah, they roomed together or stayed together at one point.
Yeah, they worked together in Quebec. Dallimore went out and kind of helped him for a little bit. When D.A. Carson is talking about how Dallimore, with no terminal degree in history, managed to do this, monumental study, Carson's visibly weeping when he's saying this, and if you know D.A. Carson, I mean, he's not the kind of guy that cries easy, And when you think of the influence of a guy like Carson that he's had, in so many different avenues, right. And for him to be that moved by a book about an 18th century revival preacher, that to me tells you something, and something of the importance Dallimore then has had on evangelicalism as a whole.
Yeah, it is a moving work. It reminds me of something I've seen recently with this book by Dane Ortlund. I don't know if you saw it, Gentle and Lowly, and the response of people who are reading it. And I had the same response. I'm really encouraged that others are having the same experience.
Wow, okay.
I was moved to tears reading it.
Wow.
Passion and love of Jesus Christ. But those are the kinds of testimonies that you get about Dallimore and this work on Whitefield. Those who've read it have been deeply impacted by it, and it certainly had that impact on me many years ago when I read those 2 volumes. And again, that testimony is multiplied, and not just by people like me, but there's, like you're saying, people whom God is using in a very influential way in our world today in terms of evangelicalism, impacted by that work. And so that's you do a good job of giving that history, that background. Carson had written about his own father, Memoirs of a Pastor.
That's a book I've wept at. I put that book down and just bawled my eyes out. It was so moving.
Yeah. So these are faithful men using the gifts that God has given them in the context where they are, and God has blessed it. And they didn't. I was reading scripture, my Bible reading today, reading about the talents and planting them in the ground, and whether we use the talent, the gift that God has given us to advance His kingdom. We all are responsible for that. And you mentioned without formal, or Carson mentioned without any formal training in terms of Dallimore, and yet he used what he had, and he used it for good, for the good of the church. And we're talking about him still today.
Yeah.
And here we are 40 years probably after the second volume came out. And what year did it come out? 80?
Oh boy, you're gonna ask a historian about dates. I know it took him 20 years to do the first volume, 10 to do the second, and I think it came out in early 80s, right?
Yeah. So we're about 40 years out, and still, whenever Together for the Gospel meets, they highlight that as one of their main things they recommend at their bookstore. It's still probably a very good, I think you mentioned the sales of it in terms of Banner of Truth. It's still one of their best-selling works. And but what you're able to do is you come at this as someone who's trained as a historian, and looking at the work that Dallimore did, not just his Whitefield biography, but he also did some lesser, I think you used the term lesser works or smaller works.
Yeah, I use the word lesser there, much like we refer to the minor prophets.
Yeah.
I don't mean that they're lesser in terms of importance, just lesser in terms of size, really.
And they don't have the scope. He did not spend the time on them that he did on Whitefield.
Yep.
He didn't intend to do the same things with them that he did with his Whitefield work, but he did work on Spurgeon and Charles Wesley and
Susanna,
and also
Edward Irving.
Edward Irving, proto-charismatic,
Yep.
at least as Dallimore presents him. And all of those works have great strengths, but also you were able to look at his work and analyze it in terms of where does he fit in this. There's a debate. People who are watching, only people interested in watching there's a few weird people in the world who are interested in this podcast.
Yeah.
And you and I would be two of them, but the
Might be
other
the only
three,
two.
yeah, no, there's like three more, but they're aware of this conversation, but there might be some who are just peeking in, maybe interested in Whitefield or Ian Clary fans. So in Christian, the study of church history among Christians, there's a debate about how we should do church history, with one extreme saying it needs to be very objective, without a reference to supernatural, kind of tipping your hand that of a belief in supernatural divine intervention, just really dealing with the historical facts of what happened, and allow them. I mean, I'm giving a caricature that's a bit extreme,
Right.
but you can explain this a little bit further. And then there's those who would be accused of doing something called hagiography, using from a term hagios, meaning saint or holy, where really a person is presented as a hero with no blemishes whatsoever. Talk about those two extremes. You use terms like supernatural or providentialist, historian, versus, I think you use the term objectivist, and what's another term you use for the other side of that?
Yes, objective is probably the best one. Scholarly or academic history, professional historian is probably the one you're thinking of.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you map that out really well. I mean, there are, again, these two broad approaches. I mean, it's a spectrum in one sense. Where you do have the extreme on that objective side of a kind of a pure methodological naturalism that some people will call it, where any concern for religion or theology or anything like that is just, it's verboten. You can't even talk about it. And then the opposite side is there's you're writing history so theologically, so religiously, that you almost don't get the real person that you're writing about, because it's clouded by these other concerns. And probably the best way to illustrate the two more kind of balanced perspectives on those two approaches would be if you compared the biographies written of Jonathan Edwards by Ian Murray and George Marsden, right? So Ian Murray, longtime director, I guess, of the Banner of Truth, and himself a phenomenal historian, writes from that kind of what we call providentialist approach, writes a biography of Edwards, which is just an awesome book. I mean, I absolutely love it. And he writes with a remarkable sympathy for Edwards in terms of his person, his theology, and writes very much with the idea of like looking at how Murray would see God's hand in Edwards' life. That's the providence. And then Marsden, who is an academic historian who was at Calvin and then at Notre Dame, publishes his also awesome biography of Edwards, and it was in 2003 for the anniversary of Edwards' birth. And with Yale University Press, is an academic work. You don't get much in terms of the way God is shaping Edwards' life, and you're going to get a lot more of Marsden offering criticisms. And those are you put those two together. I'll often say, if you really want to get a good picture of who Jonathan Edwards was, you need to read both of these biographies, right?
Yeah.
And I think that illustrates well these kind of two approaches.
Mm-hmm.
And what sort of happens is that it's become a bit of a debate of one approach against the other, and I don't think that needs to happen. I think that both approaches are legitimate, and that you have different purposes for writing according to each approach. But it turned into a pretty acrimonious debate over Whitefield. Yeah. And Dallimore jumped right into that in the thick of it when the Banner of Truth kind of had a dispute with the Yale historian Harry Stout, when Stout wrote his very now infamous biography of Whitefield called The Divine Dramatist. Mm-hmm. He writes as an academic historian, and he's pretty critical of Whitefield at certain parts. And Dallimore wrote a review of that biography in Reformation and Revival Journal, and he was not happy with it. And so you get the kind of tension here. And so what I was trying to do in my dissertation is, trace that debate. I do that in one of my chapters, trace that debate, argue for a kind of third way that kind of incorporates both, and then plug Dallimore into where he stood in that debate, and then tried then to kind of like evaluate his work, according to kind of like standards of history that really need to be met if you're going to do a reliable biography. So that was kind of what I was trying to do.
Yeah, you did a good job with the third way you present, and you use Esther, the book of Esther, as a model for that as well. But let me, the way I see this, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's like they're too extreme. I think Stout almost represents an extreme in the approach where he takes he would almost explain away the supernatural by using human elements to describe, or sociological approaches to explain away supernatural. And then you may have, on the other hand, someone who might be doing hagiography. Everyone would label as hagiography, but for maybe the person doing it, that it is an extreme position that just explains everything in terms of a supernatural without ever recognizing kind of the historical context. Those would be extreme approaches, and both of them are out there. Really, Dallimore wasn't on either end of that. He's sometimes lumped with that hagiographical side, but you show that he doesn't neatly fit on that, on the caricature of that. But you are arguing for a position, and I think we see this, with Marston and Kidd to some degree, and then, like you said, there's a spectrum. I don't know where exactly where to draw those lines, but where there are people who are open to the supernatural, but do not explicitly say. I think in the study of revival is where it really gets. That's where it's
a bit of a litmus test.
Because how do we interpret this? Is it merely a sociological phenomenon, or is the Holy Spirit at work in this? And there's some historians who will step back and say, I can't really say, and we just need to be really careful. I remember Marsden wrote, is it an afterword? I don't remember you mentioning it in your work, but he wrote like an afterword in one of his works where he talks about how it's like watching a football game. I don't know if he's talking about American or Canadian football. I'm assuming American.
CFL, man. Less down,
Okay,
smaller field.
So he says it's like watching a football game where half the players are invisible. Do you remember that?
No, I don't. Actually, you're bumming me out that I didn't include this in my book.
Yeah. So what he says is that, we as historians, he's kind of writing. He believes in providence. He believes in these supernatural causes, and yet as a historian, he describes what we can see. But sometimes you see a guy. If you imagine watching a football game where half the players were invisible, sometimes all of a sudden you'd see a guy catapulted over to another direction, and you're like, what happened? Well, as a historian, we just say, Marston would say, as a historian, I'd say, well, somehow he just catapulted that way.
Yeah.
Someone who understands God's providence and his active role in history, would say, okay, there are divine, there are providential things that are happening. And of course, I use that term providential, and you do a good job showing. I think Babington talking about general providence versus special providence. It's everything that happens in history is providence. Usually, sometimes we only talk about it in terms of something that's positive. So anyway, what's your reactions to that?
Yeah, I actually really, that's a great illustration. I am lamenting that I haven't included that in. I'll have to do a second edition of the book and include that footnote here. But yeah, that's a good way to think of it. In the debate, when it kind of turns a little bit kind of acrimonious, the accusation will get lobbed against the so-called objective or professional historians that, oh, you would butcher the book of Acts because you're not willing to see providence, and Luke obviously sees providence. He talks about it. And, some of the responses to that have been, I think, helpful. I think it's Timothy Larson out of Wheaton's kind of making an appeal to Luther's concept of, Deus absconditus, the God, the hidden God that, we have nothing to do with because he's hidden. He's not revealing himself. And a lot of God's providential dealings in history, which he obviously does, we can't always discern. The historian doesn't have enough tools in his toolkit to be able to actually discern exactly what's going on in this particular moment of a historical event. So to say, well, because I can't speak to that isn't necessarily a denial of providence. It's just saying I can't interpret that providential act right now. And so I had thought of how the book of Esther in the Old Testament is kind of like an example of being able to speak historically in a way, acknowledging God's providence without specifically mentioning him, because God doesn't expressly get mentioned in Esther. Yet
Right.
when you read Esther with a careful eye, you see God all over the book.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is that when Ian Murray reviews Marsden's biography of Edwards, he basically acknowledges that that's what Marsden is doing. Yep. And I love that review of Murray, because he is as much as he's very committed to his principles, he's also willing to see, that Marsden's done a phenomenal work. And he said, I think he said something like, Marsden's almost an apologist for Edwards. And that was really cool,
Yeah.
So it was actually, because Dr. Haykin supervised the dissertation, he had sent me a source that was really helpful in developing my thoughts along this way. It was by Andrew Atherstone, and it was a paper he gave at the Westminster Conference that had been started as the Puritan Conference by Martin Lloyd-Jones. And he gave a paper on, I think it was like history and hagiography or something like that it's called. And he argues basically for this kind of third way, where he says, look, you can do both, a kind of tertium quid. And really what we need to do here is consider the audience. If you're a historian and you're writing for the church, for pastors, for the laity who are interested in these things, then it's entirely appropriate to kind of speak more about God, to speak in an encouraging theological way that's written to encourage Christians in their faith. But if you're writing to an audience that is directed towards the academy with an academic press or something like that, it's also okay. You're not compromising your faith, like the author of Esther, to not directly have to mention these things. And in both cases, you can do good Christian history. And so I think that that's really important. And again, our mentor Michael Haykin does a phenomenal job at this. He embodies, I think, this approach to history, where he will write popular level books in ways where, how often have you had people come up to you and you're talking about Haykin and they're like, oh, like whatever, that book on St. Patrick that he wrote, or this one on John Sutcliffe. I mean, they stirred my affections. Like that's so great. And yet he can also write very academic works with academic presses and really make a scholarly contribution. And so that's just the approach I want to take as a historian myself. So.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, and Haykin is a good model of that. Many others we could probably point to as well, but he does a good job of showing of doing that. He doesn't downplay or hide obscure defects in the people he's studying, and yet he's also not afraid to write for the church, for believers, to encourage them. One of the challenges you talk about, I think, the farther and farther we get away from a historical event, it becomes a little bit easier then to talk about what was God doing. I mean, it's really hard when you're right up against, just think about our own lives when we're, we know God is providentially working in our lives, and yet it's very hard to see when you're right in the midst of it. It takes perspective, and sometimes we have that later in our life to look back and say, okay, I see what God was doing now, or I think I see what God is doing now. But, sometimes it takes a perspective of centuries to see the outcome, because what initially may seem positive or negative, it may not actually be a positive and negative long term. Think about Robertson several years ago when he immediately announced Hurricane Katrina as a judgment of God. That is, does God, we would agree, God does intervene, and God does send judgment, and yet we're not in the position to be able to make those kinds of pronouncements. And so that was almost like a historical pronouncement he's making, and this is what is happening. But it was too soon to make that kind of a statement, and we don't have that. We don't have the divine perspective. That's the thing would, would push back to those who say, well, you would discard the book of Acts or something like that. Well, I'm as a historian, I do not have the Holy Spirit protecting me from errors.
Right.
My
Yeah.
judgments are true. So I'm left to do history in a way that accounts for the fact that I'm not inspired by the Holy Spirit.
Absolutely. That's actually a key factor is that, I mean, in a sense, what Pat Robertson was doing there was confusing the task of the historian with that of the Old Testament prophet. And the Old Testament prophet has a specific vocation and calling by God that the historian doesn't have. And so, yeah, we, from our vantage point, without divine inspiration or inerrancy on our end for our pronouncements, we really have to hold interpretations with a loose hand and be willing to be challenged, if other pieces of evidence come our way.
This is the book I was talking about by Marsden.
Yeah.
And there's an afterword. Word. Yeah, there you go. History and fundamentalism. Is that backwards?
Okay. Nope.
No, backwards on there. Okay, good. But he talks about, he quotes from Richard Lovelace, where he says, it is as confusing when history, when it's viewed without a proper awareness of the spiritual forces involved, quote, is as confusing as a football game in which half the players are invisible.
Perfect.
And then he comes down and he uses, you'll like this too, J.R.R. Tolkien. He says, this is Marsden speaking now. He says, I find that a Christian view of history is clarified if one considers reality as more or less like the world portrayed in the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. We live in the midst of contests between great and mysterious spiritual forces, which we understand only imperfectly, whose true dimensions we only occasionally glimpse. Yet, frail as we are, we do play a role in this history on the side either of the powers of light or of the powers of darkness. It is crucially important, then, that by God's grace, we keep our wits about us and discern the vast difference between the real forces for good and the powers of darkness disguised as angels of light. I thought that was a really good insight to think of in terms of, a Middle Earth history of what Tolkien is doing. And oftentimes the characters in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are not aware of what is kind of the big picture of what's going on. And yet they're plugging along. I think of the end of the, sorry to hijack this conversation, but to go to
it's good.
talk about the end of The Hobbit, where Bilbo says to Gandalf, it's like, so the ancient prophecies did come true in a sense. And Gandalf says, well, kind of laughs and says, well, did you think because you were a part of them that didn't, it wasn't the prophecy? He said, you're a very nice hobbit or something like that. You remember the quote at the end?
I don't know.
Section, and he said, you're a very nice hobbit after all, but you're only a really small part of this world or something like that. And Bilbo kind of puffs on his pipe and says, thank goodness. In other words, there is a bigger picture of what's going on. But in the midst of it, we miss that sometimes. And as historians, we can do both, like you're saying. We can do both. We can write about the things that are observable in the world, and yet also recognize, even by someone like Marsden here, you see, he doesn't write, we wouldn't put him in the category of a providentialist in terms of how he does history, and yet he has a view of that there are divine forces at work, supernatural forces.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because I don't know if you've read Gavin Ortland's book that came out maybe about 7-8 months ago called Theological Retrieval for Evangelicals.
No, I haven't, but I haven't read it yet.
It's great. It is so good. And I think he does that in there too, where he uses that same imagery from Tolkien and the idea of like God's vantage point, and then how he is sovereign and providentially in control over history, and yet historical actors within the storyline are still actually doing things freely. And he's relating it in a way kind of like almost a sort of a compatibilism between freedom and divine sovereignty. But that's great.
Yeah. Well, your work does a wonderful job of navigating through all those historiographical issues, especially for evangelicals, as we look at these issues. And again, you come down you evaluate Dallimore in terms of his Whitefield work, and you see him as not being hagiographic, if you can say it that way, in his approach, because he's willing to point out things. What's some of the things like that he would point out with someone that he has great esteem for?
Yeah, so I mean, the charge is that Dallimore has just written a hagiography, as you're saying, right? So he's written this monumental 2-volume work, and there's no criticisms at all, or at least no significant ones. And enough reviewers, I think Ian Maddock in his book on Wesley kind of accuses him of that, and some others, and I just didn't think it was fair. And it's not to say that he didn't greatly admire Whitefield. It's not to say that his interpretations of Whitefield weren't colored at times. I would not want to deny that, but I also wouldn't want to say that he's not critical. And probably the most important criticism is over that really obviously very problematic area of slavery. And I mean, in our day right now, when we're dealing with all of these issues of race and, you know, Black Lives Matters and all this, this is obviously becoming much more important. I mean, you know, University of Pennsylvania is just, there's an article in the Spectator saying that they're going to pull their Whitefield statute down because he owned slaves. And for somebody to write a hagiography, you would think require them not to mention the slavery issue, right?
And this was 50 years. This is 50 years ago. He's writing this, not in this context.
Exactly right. When there is actually a lot of racism around, where you can be you know, in polite company and state racist remarks and nobody would bat an eye, and yet here he is in that kind of context being very critical of Whitefield on racism. Now there is a sense where he does at times try to put it in a better light than somebody today might be in terms of a criticism of Whitefield. But he's still nevertheless very disappointed in the fact that Whitefield owned slaves. And he doesn't go as far with it as later historians have done in terms of the critique of Whitefield and slavery. So you mentioned Tommy Kidd. Tommy Kidd's awesome recent biography of Whitefield published with Yale. Again, Kidd's another example of just a great historian, you know, who has such a balanced approach. And he discovered that not only did Whitefield own slaves, or did he, you know, help bring slavery to Georgia, the colony of Georgia, he actually did it illegally before it actually happened, you know, and that was like really sad to find out. I'll be honest, I had a very hard time in that section with the dissertation. I can remember sitting at the bottom of my mother's staircase, going up to my old bedroom in my old house that I grew up in, on the phone with Dr. Haykin, just livid, like just really upset with Whitefield, and him kind of having to like talk me off the ledge and say, look, like this is the whole point, right? Like great figures of the past can have great faults, and here's one with Whitefield. And so it took me a lot to have to really wrestle through that, because I really kind of started to not like Whitefield because of it. And I'm sure Dallimore probably went through the same sort of experience. It seems that way, at least. And so I thought, here's a really good example of where Dallimore is willing to really level a criticism where he should. And I'm like very thankful that Dallimore did that, you know, because that would have been terrible if he hadn't.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, and you do a good job of showing how he does that, how far he goes, and how far he doesn't go in that. You're writing about someone, as you write about Dallimore and his work on Whitefield and others, you're writing about someone and you're doing something similar to what Dallimore had to do with Whitefield. This is someone you respect and admire what he's done and how he did it. And he also has, you know, Whitefield has been gone for 300 years. Dallimore still has family that are around. You interviewed his widow for your work. You got a lot of information from that kind of interaction that you've had with her. And what is it like to try to write history that is objective and fair and does what we're saying needs to happen? We need to not only point out the positives, but also point out defects. And you do that with Dallimore. You show where in other areas, not as much with Whitefield, because you found him to be a pretty good model on Whitefield. There are some small critiques that you have of him, but on some of his other works where he's writing really more apologetically
Yeah.
than it's either defending a position or arguing against a position, where he doesn't do as good historical work. What is it like to do that? And were you tempted to pull punches?
It's a tough one. I'll tell you. It's funny. I was initially enrolled in a different university. I was originally doing a PhD at the Free University of Amsterdam, and I was studying an 18th century Irish Baptist who died in 1844 named Alexander Carson. And part of me was like, oh, I just wish I'd stuck with that guy, because then I wouldn't have to worry about offending a friend or a family member. But as it turned out, I was writing a smaller biography of Whitefield for a British publisher that they had some financial issues, had to drop the book. And a good friend of mine, Clint Humphrey, who actually contributed to our festa for Dr. Haykin, Clint's a pastor in Alberta. He had suggested to me one day on the phone, he says, hey, you've done all this work on this book for Dallimore. Can't you just turn that into a dissertation? And I thought, oh my goodness, that's a great idea. And through Michael Haykin and a guy named Mark Jones, they helped me get into this other program. And it was great because I'd already had 2 years worth of work done. And it kind of fast forwarded my life by a couple of years, which was great. And so I had no real intention to do like such a big critical study of somebody who had only just passed, a few years before. So that was very difficult. And on one level, it was great because, as you said, I could go and interview Mrs. Dallimore. I write about, you can find that on my academia page. I actually have a little article about my interview with her. She was just great. And his son, Paul, had sadly, I had met with him as well. And then he sadly died, I think, before the dissertation came out. And then one of Dallimore's daughter, Cheryl, she and I went to church together. And so she was incredible in terms of she gave me so much, just masses of material to work with in terms of primary sources from Dallimore, including her mom's diary. And, so not only are these people living, but now they've done all this great stuff for me. And now I've got to if I've got to be really honest, I've got to level some criticisms here. That's a really hard thing to do. And Dallimore's granddaughter, Becky Wagler, is a really good friend of mine. And she's in Toronto. So it was just like, oh my goodness, this is terrible. And, I hope that they understand that I'm coming into this in good faith. I'm not trying to undermine them or pull the rug out from them. If anything, I'm trying to really, I think I'm ultimately trying to show this is a remarkable feat that this guy has done. He's got a Bachelor of Theology that he got in 1935 from a seminary. And he's a pastor, and he was a great pastor. And everybody who will talk to you about his pastoral ministry will tell you what a phenomenal pastor he was. And how did he write this book? And yeah, there's going to be failures, as there are with anybody, even a professional historian, right? And so it was a bit scary, to be honest with you. How is this going to be received? And so we'll see when the book comes out. But my hope is that people will kind of read it as charitably as possible, see that I'm trying to be as charitable as possible. And I'm trying to practice what I preach. I'm saying, okay, here's a figure, great things that they did, but here's some of the warts. And we need, like Cromwell says, to paint them warts and all. But it's to be a patristic historian is the way to go. I think the farther back, the better.
Well, you do a fabulous job, and I think you honor Dallimore. I mean, the fact that there's a major work published about this man is in itself reflecting not only his, obviously the greatness of what he did, but that is an honoring thing that you've done to his legacy, and it will preserve his legacy and have it in the conversation of historiography for decades to come, if not longer. And so that's a wonderful tribute that you've given just in that. But the fact that you have presented him, you didn't do a hagiography of Dallimore, the fact that you presented him wart and all makes the positives that you say about him stand out even more. I think that's what sometimes people don't realize, is that that honest approach. If you're not honest, then it undercuts your reliability and your trustworthiness, and people can really just dismiss the whole work. And they could have done that with Dallimore if you'd simply presented him that way, but you didn't. You presented him honestly. You showed the strengths. You showed showed the weaknesses. You even explained why the contexts were different, and probably why his works, later works, weren't as thorough as his former works. And I think you do a good job with that, explaining that. But you really have provided a model and an entryway into this discussion, and a way of thinking about historiography, at least in the Christian community, really within that spectrum. And you have advocated a third way, which is a good way forward, I think, for us, that doesn't fall into the errors on either extreme, but also recognizes that we can objectively study someone. But I like the citation you have of Murray. I can't remember which review. This might have been in the Edwards Marsden thing, where he says, or he may have been defending Dallimore and Whitefield. But he says, someone who shares the theology of this person, don't they have some certain insights that you might miss otherwise? I'm butchering that quote, but do you remember that quote?
I do. I know what you're talking about, but I couldn't get it to you exactly. But no, and that's a fair point, right? To be able to write, to approach a figure in a sympathetic sort of way, gives you certain insights, as does the opposite, right? You think of somebody like Ian Kershaw writing a massive, was a 3-volume biography of Adolf Hitler, and he hated Hitler, and rightly so. And yet that also is able to give him a different set of eyes. Of course, you have to be careful. What you want to do is you want to follow the canons of historical research as a science as best you can, to be able to be as objective as you can. I mean, you'll never get pure objectivity, but you want that, whatever your approach is going to be. But yeah, there's value to differing approaches.
That's what you said early on about read Murray and Marsden.
Yeah.
Because that gives you someone who's, I think they're both sympathetic in some sense, but Murray really clearly sympathetic to Edwards, sharing his theology, and can understand things that maybe a secular historian might not even pick up on, in terms of the theological language and exegetical language. Marsden certainly can pick up on those things, but he's writing from a different perspective as an objective historian. And is there a counter to Dallimore? Who would you say to read along with Dallimore on Whitefield?
Oh, for 100%, it would be Tommy Kidd. Yeah, the only drawback to Kidd's biography, when I finished it, I just was like, oh man, I just want to read more. It's just so good. And Dallimore is
relatively brief compared to, of course, compared to Dallimore.
Yeah.
But it is
absolutely. I think I reviewed Kidd for his biography for Themelios after it came out, and I said, and here I am writing as the guy on Dallimore, and I'm like, yeah, I think Kidd's now the standard. But Dr. Kidd, he was phenomenal in terms of his help with me on my dissertation, and he said, the amount of times that I consulted Dallimore for my own biography. I mean, he's very positive.
He's very positive about Dallimore. Although, obviously we'll recognize there's things that Dallimore missed. But Kidd, what a Christian gentleman he is.
Amazing. I love him.
Great scholar.
Yeah.
So, Ian, thank you for your work. I was really, I just loved reading the book. I know a few other nerds like me will enjoy reading it as well.
Maybe this guy one day.
This guy one day will read it.
Another Tommy.
If someone's writing the historiography of Ian Clary, he might be the one that's offended by it. But
that's right. He's going to take up arms on my behalf against some erstwhile historian.
Well, thank you for your friendship, and I'll let you get to the family now. Thank you for taking the time. I know we've gone a while, but these are fun conversations for me. Conversations with friends about church history, and I've always said, if no one else likes it, as long as I enjoy it, that's all that matters. So I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
No, thank you. I appreciate your friendship, and over the years, the work we've done together. I hope we do more together, and just getting to hang out and chat with you is has been a blessing. So thank you for having me on.
I look forward to visiting with you one day soon in a post-COVID world, or in the new heavens and earth. We'll
Yeah. Hopefully sooner than
spend
later.
some time together. All right. God bless you.
Amen, brother.